Section 8. Mr. Woodbridge had by this time reached the age of 74, and although he was a vigorous man, one Sunday morning in May, while the school waited for him in chapel, he died, open-eyed in his bed. Immediately there occurred a Byzantine struggle for succession. There is nothing wrong with admitting that by then I myself coveted the job for headmaster, for one does not remain 5 decades at a school without becoming deeply attached to its fate. But Mr. Woodbridge's death had come suddenly, and I had not yet begun the preparations for my bid. I was, of course, no longer a young man. I suppose, in fact, that I lost my advantage here by underestimating my opponents, who indeed were younger, as Caesar had done with Brutus and Cassius. I should not have been surprised then when, after several days of maneuvering, my principal rival turned out to be Charles Ellerby. For several years, I discovered he had been conducting his own internecine campaign for the position, and although I had always counted him as my ally and my friend, in the first meeting of the board, he rose and spoke accusations against me. He said that I was too old, that I had failed to change with the times, that my method of pedagogy might have been relevant 40 years ago, but that it was not today. He stood and said that a headmaster needed vigor and that I did not have it. Although I watched him the entire time he spoke, he did not once look back at me. I was wounded, of course, both professionally and in the hidden part of my heart in which I had always counted Charles Ellerby as a companion in my lifelong search for the magnificence of the past. When several of the old teachers booed him, I felt cheered. At this point, I saw that I was not alone in my bid, merely behind, and so I left the meeting without coming to my own defense. Evening had come, and I walked to the dining commons in the company of my allies. How it is, when fighting for one's life, to eat among children. As the boys in their school blazers passed around the platters of fish sticks and the bowls of sliced bread, my heart was pierced with their guileless grace. How soon, I wondered, would they see the truth of the world? How long before they would understand that it was not dates and names that had always meant to teach them? Not one of them seemed to notice that what had descended like thunderheads above their faculty. Not one of them seemed unable to eat. After dinner, I returned to the assistant headmaster's house in order to plot my course and confer with those I still considered allies. But before I could begin my preparations, there was a knock at the door. Charles Ellerby stood there, red in the cheeks. "May I ask you some questions?" he said breathlessly. "It is I who ought to ask them of you," was my answer. He came in without being asked and took a seat at my table. "You've never been married, am I correct, Hundert?" "Look, Ellerby, I've been at St. Benedict's since you were in prep school yourself." Yes, in an exaggeration of boredom. Of course he knew as well as I that I had never married nor started a family, because history itself had always been enough for me. He rubbed his head and appeared to be thinking. To this day, I wonder how he knew about what he said next, unless Sedgwick Bell had somehow told him the story of my visit to the senator. "Look," he said, "there's a rumor you keep a pistol in your desk drawer." "Hogwash!" "Will you open it for me?" he said, pointing there. "No, I will not. I have been a dean here for 20 years. "Are you telling me there is no pistol in this house?" He then attempted to stare me down. We had known each other for the good part of both of our lives, however, and the bid withered. And at that point, in fact, as his eyes fell in submission to my determined gaze, I believe the headmastership became mine. It is largely an unexplored element of history, of course, and one that has long fascinated me, that a great deal of political power, and thus a great deal of the arc of nations, arises not from intellectual advancements nor social imperatives, but from the simple battle of wills among men at tables, such as had just occurred between Charles Ellerby and me. Instead of opening the desk and brandishing the weapon, however, which of course meant nothing to me, but no doubt would have seized the initiative from Ellerby, I denied to him its existence. Why? I do not know, for I was a teacher of history, and was not the firearm its greatest engine? Ellerby, on the other hand, was simply a gadfly to the passing morals of the time. He gathered his things and left my house. That evening, I took the pistol from my drawer. A margin of rust had appeared along the filigreed handle, and despite the ornate workmanship, I saw clearly now that in its essence the weapon was ill-proportioned and blunt, the crude instrument of a violent, historically meager man. I had not even wanted it when the irascible demagogue Bell had foisted it upon me, and I had only taken it out of some vague sentiment that a pistol might eventually prove decisive. I suppose I had always imagined firing it some day in a moment of drama. Yet now here it stood before me in a moment of torpor. I turned it over and cursed it. That night I took it from the drawer again, hid it in the pocket of my overcoat, and walked to the far end of the campus. When I crossed the marsh a good mile from my house, removed my shoes, and stepping into the babbling shallows of the Potomac, "The die is cast," I said, and I threw it 20 yards out into the water. The last impediment to my headmastership had been hurdled, and by the time I came ashore, walked back, whistling to my front door, and changed for bed, I was ecstatic. Yet that night, I slept poorly, and in the morning when I rose and went to our faculty meeting, I felt that the mantle of my fortitude had slipped somehow from my shoulders. How hushed is demise! In the hall outside the faculty room, most of the teachers filed by without speaking to me, and once inside, I became obsessed with the idea that I missed this most basic lesson of the past. That conviction is the alpha and the omega of authority. Now that I see I was doomed the moment I threw that pistol in the water, for that is when I lost my conviction. It was as though Cedric Bell had risen all these years later to drag me down again. Indeed, once the meeting had begun, the older faculty members shrunk back from their previous support of my bid, and the younger ones encircled me as though I was a limping animal. And there might as well have been a dagger among the cloaks. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, Charles Ellerby, a fellow antiquarian whose job I had once helped secure, had been named headmaster, and by the end of that month, he had asked me to retire.